Thank you all so much for calling in. We're going to use this chat box quite a bit, given the number of people that are here. So when you have any questions, just go ahead and use your chat box. I'm also going to show you a poll. So right now you can answer a poll. What part of the state are you in? And you can put in your answer, and we've got several of these that we can do. So while you guys are answering that, I'll just say that my name is Nancy Hafer. I'm program director of the Resource Center for Family Focused Practice here at UC Davis. And we do a lot of training, technical assistance, and consultation for child welfare services for primarily wraparound, but expanding into all sorts of different areas. Special projects as assigned. Okay, I'm going to end the polling so you guys can see. Most folks here are from the north part of the state. Well, north, south, and central are pretty even. Bay Area, we need a few more folks from the Bay Area to call in. And only one person from the mountains? I find that hard to believe. We need some more mountain folk here. So I'm going to turn it over. Danny, would you like to introduce yourself, and we can go through and introduce all of the panel speakers today?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Danny Millay, or Danielle, and I'm with the California Alliance of Child and Family Services. We're an organization of about 145 foster care and children's mental health nonprofits. So our members are many of the FFAs around the state, as well as some of the short-term residential therapeutic programs, STRTPs, and children's behavioral health organizations. I staff the education issues, so I cover foster youth education as well as school-based mental health. And education financing. I do a lot of lobbying in the state capitol for our members and the kids that we all serve. I also cover commercial sexual exploitation of children and prevention services for the Alliance. But this was my effort to try to get some information and some resources out to resource parents, as I know we are all grappling with this new world under COVID, and it is definitely a new expectation on resource parents. So I hope that this is very helpful for everyone, and I will pass it off to our next speaker. I'll kick it over to Tamarah.
Everyone, I'm very excited to be here. My name is Dr. Tamarah Tilos. I work with Seneca Family of Agencies. We're a mental health nonprofit, and we provide a wide range of services, but I work in our school-based programs. I'm an assistant director of school partnerships. So we partner with schools to be able to provide services and build the schools, the capacity of our school partners to provide academic, social, emotional, and behavioral supports to students in their home schools to try to prevent them having to go to more restrictive programs. And that includes providing special education services, mental health services, behavior intervention support, as well as coordination with teams of outside providers, and including working with teams and families of foster youth.
Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself next?
I'm sorry, I did not realize that we were doing that. This is Michelle Lustig, and I am the program director for the Foster Youth Services Technical Assistance Program. I work for the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and our program is funded by the California Department of Education. We provide support to all of the county offices of education, foster youth services coordinating programs to ensure that they have all the supports that they need in support of their school districts, and all stakeholder groups, of course, to include caregivers. Previously ran the San Diego County Office of Education's Foster Youth Services and Homeless Ed program, and have done a lot of work in the area of child welfare and mental health and supports to students in foster care.
Okay. Thanks, Michelle. Our third speaker is Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Estes. I am a longtime children's attorney. I currently represent the public schools in California. I am the founder of a nonprofit organization called Breaking Barriers, which is all about uniting California's child-serving resources around the very real needs of children and families in California. And my expertise as an attorney in education is in public school program development and special education, and basically serving the whole child.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. I think before we jump in, we also wanted to kick it over to the Department of Social Services and see if Lori or anyone on your team wanted to say anything from CDSS. You can unmute yourself, I think, Lori. Or I can unmute. I got you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lori Fuller from the Department of Social Services. I'm the Chief of the Permanency Policy Bureau here at the department, and we have oversight of educational services policy to youth in foster care. I wanted to say thank you to our partners with LA County Department of Ed, the California Department of Social Services, Seneca, UC Davis, and others for joining with us to put this webinar on today. I think, we're all navigating some uncharted waters right now, and we know that caregivers are really challenged with this distance learning activity. So we wanted to make sure we can put forth some resources to try and make what's a very difficult and challenging situation maybe just a little bit easier. So thanks again for all of you that worked together to put the webinar on, and that's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lori. Should we go ahead and just dive into the content? We'll start off with our first speaker, which is Tamarah from Seneca Family of Agencies. And bear with us as we work out, because I have the controls on the slides.
Thanks, Danny. I had the opportunity to just introduce myself to you all. One thing that I would like to add is that my roots in this work are in direct service. I started out as a mental health counselor, working in a non-public school up here in the Bay Area, and also in our group homes when we still had quite a number of group homes in California, and not so many anymore. But started out working directly with kids and providing mental health supports in schools, and then went on to become a special education teacher. As I mentioned, now I am an assistant director of school partnerships, so I'm working with schools. And so in preparing this information, I'm coming with the lens of working with schools on this end to try to provide services that meet the needs of kids and families who are on the other end of receiving education through distance learning. And also a parent myself, so have tried to be pretty thoughtful about the impact of COVID-19 and school closures for all of you. So I hope that this content is really helpful for you today. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so just to begin, I wanted to name the objectives for this portion of the webinar. I think this will help ground us in what we're going to go over. And there'll be subheadings throughout, so you can kind of tune into like what content we'll be covering at each point of the presentation. The first thing that we're going to address is just reflecting on the impact of school closures due to COVID-19. We're going to learn what it means to provide trauma-informed distance learning, and we'll learn how to support children with special needs in distance learning. And then lastly, we'll explore tons of resources, tools, and tips for engagement and supporting your children in engaging in distance learning. So section 1, reflect on impact. I want to begin by naming that we are in a global pandemic. There are many things that are impacting all of us, and it shows up in different ways. But just to think about, just to name that this is the starting point, that there might be many things on your mind right now, having to do with shelter in place, having your work impacted, having challenges of balancing work and life demands, maybe feeling a sense of vigilance around a hyper awareness of being unsure about what's going to happen next, and this unstable sort of state that we are in worldwide. We'll cover some content in just a bit that talks a little bit more about the impacts that we all might be experiencing in different degrees that feel like worry or show up as fatigue. And we also might be thinking about the inequity and how different people are in different situations. and being impacted in different ways and may have different range of access to being able to function as normally as possible in this unnormal situation. And lastly, I hope I saw in the chat that a lot of folks have already been jumping into distance learning or working with service providers and are on Zoom regularly. I hope that folks are also experiencing some different types of opportunities that they may have not thought would come out of the situation as well. What is distance learning? This is just to ground in a common definition. Again, this might look different for everyone, but as the state, California Department of Education describes distance learning, is that it's when the instructor and the student are in two different locations, and the actual medium of the learning can look like providing audio or video instruction, where the primary communication between the student and instructor is online. It can be instructional television, video, telecourses, or other instruction that relies on computer or communications technology. But distance learning can also look like the use of print materials that were maybe mailed home, and that there are assignments that students receive and that teachers are providing some form of oral or written feedback. We'll go to the next slide. So the key points there is that it includes some sort of material, videos, television, again, it can be tech, or not, and then some sort of teacher time. And also when we say teacher time, we also are very aware that that means time with you all on the phone or emailing, and that there's parent communication with teachers as well. Go to the next slide. You know, as mentioning in the intro, we recognize that folks are in a number of different types of situations when trying to provide distance learning or facilitate the engagement with kids. There's a wide range of how folks may or may not be able to access a number of resources. The physical environment of the home, if there are multiple children in the home and family members that are also trying to work from home. This may impact the number of devices that folks require, when normally in a household you may have one computer that folks share, but now you have multiple children that need the computer at various times to be engaging in their learning, and you are also trying to work from home. So there's a lot of things that are impacted, and we recognize that all families are in different situations right now. Next, we're gonna play a clip for you about the impact on social emotional well-being. Seneca's Director of School Partnerships, Robin Detterman, was interviewed on this podcast called This Week in California, and she shares a reflection on the social emotional impact of school closures and distance learning on students who have previously experienced trauma or are otherwise emotionally vulnerable.
So Robin, how have the issues changed that the students are facing during school closure, and how has Seneca adapted to that in a virtual relationship?
You know, I think what we're seeing in schools is that children who have these specialized needs are perhaps not surprisingly children who often struggle to access school in general. Many of the children we serve are children who've experienced high levels of trauma. They're children who have had disruptions previously in their lives, or they're children who have specialized learning needs. And so when we think about what it means for them to access school only through a virtual platform, it creates a whole nother set of challenges. What we also know is that these are kids who rely on relationship and connection to the adults in their community to be successful at school, and predictability and consistency in the classroom environment. And this time has really been anything but predictable. So I think that's really meant that our teams have had to provide a shift and change the way that we think about what we do while maintaining those same underlying values of consistency, predictability, connection, and relationship in the work.
So does this mean basically doing therapy?
Great, we can go to the next slide. So as Robin describes, we know that this has a socially emotional impact on kids, And when we think about all of the impacts that it has on kids, we want to think about the impact that it has on caregivers as well. You all are much more likely to be involved, more deeply and actively involved in the day-to-day distance learning instruction to support student engagement. It likely involves a significant investment in time and, again, a range of coordination for balancing your own responsibilities and managing different schedules across kids potentially as well. If we go to the next slide, we'll go over the next two quickly here. Again, when considering the impact on caregivers, and we think about the caregiver support activities, caregivers weren't necessarily prepared to take on all of the responsibilities, and as much as school teams might be putting forth effort into collaborating with families, we want to name the implicit responsibilities that caregivers have taken on that weren't necessarily explicitly identified or agreed upon ahead of time. But we know that caregivers are now stepping up to teach academic content and provide curriculum modifications. If you have students with IEPs, that caregivers are integrating instructional ideas and interventions. They might be suggested by the instructor, but it's actually families at home that are putting things in place. We know that caregivers are helping students locate and organize instructional materials that you may also be responsible for maintaining and reporting learning progress to the student's teacher. I know I have a service provider who provides occupational therapy services, but in order to see a hard copy handwritten writing samples is asking the family to take a picture and then send that so that the OT can assess the progress that way, just as one example. But without the parent engagement, the OT would not be able to do that type of assessment. And then, of course, there's troubleshooting with technology issues. Schools typically have departments that help with tech at home. You're left to be able to figure out how to resolve any of those tech issues to support students in accessing all of the material that's being presented online. We'll go to the next slide. Other caregiver support activities we'll go over on this next slide that aren't listed there in the research. The last set of examples came from some research, but other things we know are that caregivers are then left to support social emotional needs of students that might be coming up during this time where kids are experiencing a lot of disruption in their regular schedules. Any of the impacts of trauma that might be showing up, the sense of loss and not having the connection to their peers. As those things come up, in order for kids to engage in distance learning, we know that caregivers are supporting with those social emotional needs as well. I know from supporting teachers and service providers that they're also sometimes heavily relying on families to be able to redirect behavior in a way that teachers aren't able to do through the screen. Again, that families are required to communicate with teachers and service providers during this time, which is another layer of demands, managing multiple schedules, different sets of expectations, and again, not only just troubleshooting with technology, but maybe learning different types of programs, online programs, devices, software, and managing all those pieces. We'll go on to the next slide. So when thinking about impact, science tells us that we have biological reactions to stress and anxiety that in turn impact our physical and mental health. So this is per Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, our California Surgeon General, is letting us know that any types of symptoms that you may be experiencing from stress and anxiety are not just in your head, that there's a real impact here. And the message from our Surgeon General is that this is a time that it's critically important to maintain good health. And she provides stress busting tips for caregivers in particular. That resource is included here. And that should be the top priority for us all, is taking care of ourselves. I'm going to use an analogy here. Although many of us have not been able to fly anywhere given travel restrictions, when we think about when you're on an airplane and they're giving the instruction about what to do in the event of an emergency. Adults who are flying with children are advised to put their oxygen mask on first before they assist a child. When you think about that analogy, it's the same thing. We want to make sure that the message comes through that you all are strongly encouraged to take care of yourselves first in order to be able to support students during this time. That will bring us into part 2. Okay. So when we're thinking about trauma-informed distance learning, part of providing distance learning supports for your kids through a trauma lens, a trauma-informed lens, is again starting with taking care of yourself. So if we go back to Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's stress busting toolkit that the link is provided there for. What she has are self-care templates for families. What you see on the slide here is just one example of a checklist that supports families in setting goals around building supportive relationships. She identifies 6 areas, and in the template you will see the goal setting template for all 6 areas. And again, these are supportive relationships, physical activity, quality sleep, balanced nutrition, mindfulness practice, and mental health care. Another resource for thinking about trauma-informed distance learning is an article included here. The article features an educational leader in trauma-informed teaching named Alexis Chevron-Vanette. And she identifies that while it might be inappropriate to oversimplify trauma-informed teaching into cookie-cutter practices, that is to say that any strategy identified is not going to be a one-size-fits-all for all kids. We always have to consider students' individual needs and experiences, as well as their assets, their risks, and their protective factors as well. So there's not a one-size-fits-all in what we're going to share with you today, but there are research-based basic guiding principles to follow, and that's for educators and now for caregivers facilitating distance learning at home. And these 4 core priorities that we'll go over a little bit more in depth over each one are predictability, flexibility, connection, and empowerment. For predictability, why? Trauma can create intense feelings of unpredictability. There's the loss of our usual routines that can cause shock and grief. It can be jarring to the system. And prioritizing, establishing, and maintaining new routines can provide a sense of safety. So taking a look at what we lost and how we might be impacted, and then creating new routines. It gives us some consistency, predictability, one less thing to worry about when we know what's to come in a day. How we'll be able to, as a student, how I'm going to be able to connect with my teacher or my therapist throughout the day. This is just one example of a student schedule at with one of our school partners where they design these visual schedules for all students. If that's something that your school has not provided, it's definitely something you could request or create on your own. There's some resources in here later where they provide some templates and things. That's something you could either request or create. But very nice for students to have that predictability of what to expect, who do I get to connect with and when, and what is my day going to look like each day. Go to the next slide. Now, while it's very supportive and helpful to have predictability, we also want to honor and facilitate flexibility with everything that's going on. It's really important during this time to communicate with teachers, to prioritize, and service providers to prioritize what's most important for your child. For some, it's school provides a really helpful outlet, and that's helps them cope. And for other kids, self-care in a different way may be a top priority. And so it's very important to work with families to be flexible while you want to have clear expectations and set routines. It's also important to recognize when that just might not be working and when the child might need a break for that day, or where you might need to come back together with your team to make some adjustments to their schedule. Maybe the service is not at the right time of day for you or the child. Maybe the student needs more time or less time with the given teacher or service provider, but it's important to recognize those needs and be flexible. For connection, we know that relationship is the key to resilience. It's really important to find age-appropriate ways during this time to foster relationships for your child between peers, between service providers, between other educators. We know that there's a model by Stephen Porges called the polyvagal theory, and we know that all of us, adults and children, will first resort to talking to others who they trust to engage and co-regulate and maintain calm. That's going to be one of our biggest resources during this time, is finding ways to continue to connect with people, although we've lost our typical social connection, but finding different ways to do that. I put the example here where on Sesame Street, Elmo hosts a Zoom party, so you can see that social connection as one example there. The last tenet or core priority is around empowerment. The why is because trauma or traumatic events can take power from people or give people an experience of feeling powerless. And then when events like this occur, it can be triggering. So prioritizing empowerment can look like opportunities for shared decision making and authentic choice. So again, going back to that predictability and flexibility and connection, what are ways you can authentically provide choice and opportunity where you can involve your child in the decision-making process of what their day will look like. And also, there have also been some creative ways where teachers or service providers have engaged children in giving voice to their experience. I've seen some high school students create their own podcasts or videos to share and document the impact of COVID-19 and school closures. So they could be either advocates in their own experience and their own learning, but they could also consider ways of what's meaningful to them or what are their strengths right now and how might they funnel some of this energy into feeling empowered and having an impact in the world during this time. So that was our section on trauma, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about supporting children with special needs during distance learning. In this audio clip that we'll listen to, educators share about how they've gotten creative to serve students with disabilities. We'll go ahead and play.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Walden University. At Walden, they see greatness in you, and they have a doctoral degree program that can help you reach your full potential. Turn your passion into power and ignite your career. Learn more about our online doctoral programs at waldenu.edu/doc.
Of the many challenges in moving schools online, special education is one of the biggest, which is why teachers and therapists are getting creative. NPR's Alyssa Nedborny reports.
When schools in Wilton, Connecticut closed, Katie Miller had to transform her speech therapy sessions with elementary students onto the internet. Miller's been with the district 5 years, and none of that was online. But in the last few weeks, she's had to build a sort of digital classroom. She sends me a link so I can see how it works.
It functions pretty similarly to how I would do it in my classroom.
She's using a software called Presence Learning. There's a video chat component, but also digital versions of the tools that Miller has always used to help her students communicate better. This week, she's working with her students on articulation and letter sounds. The software makes it into a game.
Can you see the activity?
She fills the screen with an activity grid. There are numbers 1 through 6 with words next to them.
Plop a dice in.
A die appears on screen.
You just click the dice and it'll roll for you.
I click the die and it rolls and lands on the number 2. I look for that number. It's the word urchin.
Okay, so we're working on our sound. We're going to find it here at the beginning of the word in urchin.
To make that sound, Miller says the tongue needs to come back and up. When the student gets the sound right, they can click the digital die again to try another word or sound. When schools first went to distance learning, parents and teachers were concerned that students with disabilities would fall through the cracks and not have their services available. But now,
we're seeing kids have services because people are being creative.
Kelly Grillo works for Cooperative School Services and oversees special education at 2 school districts in Indiana. She's inspired by the way teachers have adapted. For example, she has a 2nd grader who is immobile and nonverbal. She and her team have been brainstorming ways he can use his family's smart speaker while he's at home. There's an occupational therapist Grillo works with that sent packets home detailing ways to grip a pencil. Included in the delivery, extra pencils. And it's not all high bandwidth tools. For students who don't have access to good internet, Grillo and her team, like lots of teachers, are leaning on old-fashioned phone calls and text messages.
It's really actually quite exciting. A geek like me thinks like, wow, this is actually changing a field to create access for kids with disabilities far beyond what anybody could imagine.
Still, for many teachers and therapists, what they do is so intensely personal. A computer just doesn't cut it. Joy Lawrence is a speech and language pathologist at the high school in Wilton, Connecticut. She says she's mostly video chatting with students.
Fiercely. Can you say that? Yeah.
Please.
Try again.
She loves being able to see her kids, but she says with this new innovation, there are still lots of limitations. For example, one of her tricks in person is to change the volume of her voice.
The softer your voice is when you're next to them, the more they pay attention, the more they listen. So you're like yelling into this speaker and your voice is echoing through the house. It's really difficult.
Many of her students have autism or attention disorders. For them, eye contact and physical proximity is essential. But in this new normal, she says she's just doing the best she can.
You're watching me type?
Yeah.
You're doing a great job. This is hard to do on a screen like this and sharing it with each other, right?
Yeah.
You're doing really well, though.
Lawrence knows none of this can replace the personal one-on-one learning she can do at school. Her main hope is that these digital tools will help her maintain the relationship she's built with her students. So when they're back in school, whenever that ends up being, they can get right back to the hard work. Alyssa Nadworny, NPR News.
I want to call out a few things that were highlighted in that clip. First, you hear that the speech and language pathologist is providing services virtually. And we know that a lot of folks have never had any telehealth experience or even training before, and now that's essentially what the hat that teachers and service providers are putting on. And while though there is some limitations or barriers that they mention, like the background noise if you're trying to work on speech production or articulation of sounds, those things can get in the way. But part of what I heard those service providers do in those video clips are just normalize, like this is the context that we're working within. There are some limitations, but there are also ways that folks have been able to get really creative. Not only to maintain connection with kids, which is absolutely critical as we just talked about, but also to provide services in a different way. I also appreciated that they noted that the service provider team was providing tangible materials as well, not just the virtual supports. So dropping off a packet that included extra pencils. I don't know if any of your kiddos have OT, but for those that are working on having the right amount of pressure, I've had kids that just go through pencil after pencil. It's not intentional, but they don't know the right amount of pressure to apply and they break and break and break. If you think about different types of supports that some kids might need, it comes down to a range of materials, and we want to make sure that kids have things like that they need at home. The other thing I wanted to mention, just like the service providers who are now providing services via telehealth or teachers teaching virtually, which is wearing a brand new hat, it's the same thing, again, reflecting on the impact on caregivers. I heard an interview with Steph Curry, and he from the Golden State Warriors, and he was saying His daughter, who I think is in 2nd grade, rated him a 2 or a 3 as a teacher, whereas obviously he's a very multi-talented basketball player there. But again, we're all wearing different hats, and some pretty creative things have actually come as a result. I wanted to share, before we get into the overview of resources, I did want to share just a few quotes that came from some Seneca service providers in the recent weeks. One is that a Seneca parent shared that her daughter has been able to do classwork and therapy via Zoom. And without that, she just reflected on how much more the mental health of the whole family would be suffering. She was very grateful to have the digital or virtual access. There's a wraparound facilitator in Santa Clara County who shared one of their clients is also receiving all of their services virtually, that IEP team meetings have been held also on the computer, and that actually in this distance learning model and while meetings are being held virtually, that it's actually allowed her team to stay in even more contact with her than they would have been otherwise. I've seen that as well with the teachers and families that I work with, where now it was really difficult within the constraints of a school schedule for all students to get individualized services. Sometimes it'd be groups, sometimes it'd be pushed into the classroom, and we would reserve some of the one-on-one for students with higher needs, whereas now, with distance learning, while it might be for shorter durations of time, many students are receiving one-on-one support that's tailored for them, that's providing support for their individualized learning goals. And so that's also been a benefit to the shift towards distance learning. This part is about resources. So we will start going through a bunch of resources. I'm going to skim and highlight a few, but then these are all available to you. I tried as best as I can to include links so that you can find anything that you might be looking for that we talk about today. And I also want to make sure that we mention some of the whys, because one of the things that I identified at the start of this section is that there's no one size fits all. So it's really important to recognize what your students' individual needs might be in order to determine what might work best for them. So for example, a big piece of what caregivers are taking on during this time is supporting with the organization and time management. Some of the ways that you can support your child and gaining some more independence in that arena, in addition to that visual schedule we talked about, are listed here. So we'll start with daily planners. When we think about daily planners, there's a few different reasons why we would use this. And there's different modes. So a lot of the supports that teachers are providing because of the constraints of school closure, teachers are also providing visual schedules or calendar invites. I'm hearing a lot of feedback, Nancy. Are you hearing that too? Maybe let me know if there's anything I can do to adjust. Okay. Okay. Thank you for the tech intervention. Okay.
Hi, Tamarah. So most people probably, I muted everybody, so you might want to repeat the last 10 seconds.
Okay.
Because you were included in everybody that I muted.
Okay. Oh, got it. Okay. I will just do a brief recap in case folks were not able to hear what I was saying because of that echo. The emphasis here is that we know that caregivers have taken on a lot of the work of organizing materials, schedules, etc., and helping students manage. So in addition to it, providing a visual schedule that we looked at before, there are a few other supports that might be really beneficial again, with the focus of building the independence of your child to be able to engage in distance learning. And we want to think about that not one strategy is appropriate for all kids. We want to think about what we're choosing and why. So for example, with daily planners, for some kids, having calendar invites on a Google Calendar, if that's something that they were accustomed to during school, when schools was open. That might be an effective way for them to look at their schedule to see what's coming up next, to be able to click on a link independently. That works for some kids. For other kids, it might be helpful for them to have a paper planner, like an actual daily planner where they can write in their assignments. If we're thinking about different learning needs, the act of actually handwriting reinforces whatever it is that we're writing down in our memory. So for some kids who need help with remembering things, it could be helpful for them to write it down. It could also be helpful for students in their daily planners to use different color coding, different colored markers, different colored Post-its. So maybe is for my general education teacher, I use orange, and for my therapist, I use pink, or whatever those colors are. Organize and know what to expect and plan for. For students who need support with motivation, I don't know if anyone else is like this, but I know I really like crossing things off my list because it's positive reinforcement in a very naturally occurring way. And so for kids to be able to cross something off their list or put a sticker, those types of things can support students depending on their different organizational needs. Checklists, again, that is another way to organize, and that can look different. It can be less busy than a daily planner and give students what they need to focus on for that day or for that session. Keeping an organized workspace, again, we know probably a lot of that falls back on caregivers, but finding ways to support students and maintaining a workspace, whether they know, it doesn't mean that they have to have an office or a desk per se, but that they know the designated area where they're going to do their work, where they're going to keep their materials, their physical materials that they have to have. Where are they going to set up their computer? Do they need headphones? Do they need a study corral or something to block their vision? Would it be helpful for the student to focus and stay organized? If they put everything back in the same container or box or same space, or that their desk space is facing a wall or a window and there's not a lot that they see behind the screen when they're trying to focus. We'll go to the next slide. These are organized, all of these resources are organized by topic areas. So this one is just continuing a little bit on how, this next slide is continuing a bit on how adults can support organization and time management. I think you might be one slide ahead of me there, Danny. But I'll go over these ones. It is using a visual timer. Can be a really effective strategy. You can do that. There are pretty cool ones you can find online, but you could also just do that on a phone to set a visual timer to know, okay, I'm going to work on this task for 20 minutes, and then the student actually sees the countdown of time. And providing graphic organizers and visual timelines can also be a support to increasing the amount of time that students can work independently. So okay, first I'm going to complete this task and then I'm going to complete this task. Here's my timeline. And it can help students start to organize their own days without as much reliance on you. The next slide, I think. Oh, yep. You're a bit ahead of me.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We are on distance learning for students with special needs, sample accommodations and modifications.
That
so
right?
One behind this one prior to this one. Should say text to speech should be the first sample accommodation. There we go. Okay, great. So accommodations and modifications, if you have children with IEPs, these are agreed upon with the special education team, you included. So I'm giving sample ones to give ideas for two reasons. One, this is an opportunity for you to review your child's accommodations and either ask for any support that you need to implement the existing accommodations and modifications at home during distance learning. That can be in material ways. For example, if your kiddo usually has a wiggle seat in the classroom, And that's something that would be really beneficial to them if they're sitting on a dining room table chair. I know I was doing that at the beginning of this shift to distance learning, and my dining room chairs were very uncomfortable. And I realized I needed to shift my space. But for a kid, if they had that accommodation during the class in the classroom, it would probably be very beneficial for them to have it at home. So finding out what support or access you might have from the school to be able to provide those material things at home. But also considering if there are other digital ways that that accommodations and modifications can be provided. We're going to go over some of those. But going back to the point of when we look at these accommodations and modifications, these are sample ones, but I want you to think about what are things that your kid should be getting that they would have been getting in the school setting that could be helpful at home, and how do you get support implementing that or gaining access? And then additionally, as we go over these, do you hear any that you think actually might be necessary that your student didn't have before written into their IEP, but now in the distance learning environment, they would actually really benefit from? So for example, text to speech. There are various forms of assistive technology that allow text selection to be read out loud. So again, if we're thinking about increasing access and independence, I'm the student, I am in 2nd grade, and I'm been given a reading passage, but I'm below grade level in reading. I can't read it by myself. So the text-to-speech function would allow me to highlight the text on the computer and then have the computer read it aloud to me. So I could listen and follow along, and then maybe I need to do that a couple of times, and then I can respond to my reading comprehension questions as one example. So that would be text-to-speech. Speech to text would be an example of assistive technology where, again, I have lots of great, rich ideas. I'm that same 2nd grader. I have a lot of great, rich ideas. I know a lot about the topic being presented, but I have difficulty handwriting and expressing my ideas in writing at the same speed that I'm thinking. So it's actually really hard for me to get my ideas out on paper. And I don't know how to type yet. So speech to text function or type of assistive technology would allow a student to be able to speak just like I'm doing now, and it would record all of my words. And then I'd be able to read it back and then make any edits, but it would record what I'm saying so I could provide verbal responses to be able to demonstrate what I know and not let my difficulty with handwriting or typing get in the way of me being able to demonstrate independently to a teacher what I actually know about whatever it is they're asking me. Similarly to the text-to-speech, but for whole texts, students can have access to audiobooks so that there's a digital recording that students can listen to books that are either assigned or books that they're reading or listening to for their choice that allows students to access books that might be beyond their reading level, but about things that they're actually interested in. There's tons of free resources through the libraries, but also this is something, if it's in the student's IEP, that the school should be helping provide to the family and to the student. When we're thinking about accommodations and modifications are when we actually change the expectation of the output, not just the form or the type of support. So shortened assignments, for example, is an example of a modification where as a team, you might say, you know what, it's more beneficial for my kid to have shortened assignments that focus on the mastery of the skill instead of having repeated practice. So instead of having 10 multi-digit addition and subtraction problems, it might be more beneficial for your child to have 3 multi-digit addition and subtraction problems where they're showing their work or they're describing how they're borrowing or something like that, right? That they can focus on the key concept rather than having the repetition or practice of the skill and being required to do so many problems. The research says, and you're probably seeing it yourselves at home, that this is not a time where we want to have our kids focused on busy work. We really want them engaged in meaningful practice and work that's meaningful and relevant to help them maintain skills and knowledge and use this as an opportunity to, again, focus on what is essential. We'll go to the next slide. And these are a few more sample accommodations and modifications. Manipulatives are things that are tactile or 3D objects that students can manipulate to learn the skills and problem solve. So oftentimes in math, students might have, I'm thinking in younger grade students might have block 10 cubes where they can see what a stick of 10 cubes looks like all together, what the block of 100 looks like, and then the individual cubes so that they can use that to have a visual and tactile representation when they're problem solving. Again, building off that multi-digit addition example. But there's a wide range of, that's just one example. There's a wide range of what manipulatives can look like. If your student has that written into their IEP, you want to consider what could you do at home that would replicate having those tactile or 3D objects. And if you don't have anything at home, that's again where you'd reach out to your student's team to say, hey, can you send us some things that we might be able to use to support the students' problem solving in a tactile way. Similarly, with fidgets and a wiggle seat, this would be if the student was using something at school that would be helpful at home, is there a way to either replicate it or gain access to whatever it was, whatever tools they were using for calming and sensory input, so to help them focus, like a fidget or a wiggle seat. And then lastly, the behavior incentive chart. I've seen some pretty fun and creative things that teachers and service providers are doing in terms of virtual rewards. So for example, if a student is working on an agreed upon goal about work completion and they've completed their sessions with that teacher for the week and have done what they were expected to do, I have a teacher who is doing virtual puppy play dates, so where they would then both have their dogs in the Zoom and they would have a virtual puppy play date as a reward for having completed the work or the sessions for that week, as one example. But again, so that could be time with a teacher or a caregiver, or it could be a tangible reward, but trying to maintain those supports that might have been working in school or supports that weren't in school but might seem necessary now given the distance learning scenario that changes how kids are learning. One more big resource I want to share with you all is this website called understood.org. If you're not familiar, I recommend it for families with students with special needs. They provide a ton of resources in general, but they're also doing weekly updates on the coronavirus pandemic, how it affects everyone, and how it specifically creates added challenges for some people with special needs. And it includes resources for kids and adults with learning differences or disabilities. So I think that's definitely something that I would recommend just to get a sense of what kind of resources you'd find there. In their weekly roundups, they include how to talk to kids about the coronavirus. They talk about how families are coping, opportunities to engage in support groups with other families. Obviously, they talk about the school closing and distance learning, at-home activities, schedules, community groups, partner sites, as well as disability issues that might be coming up at work for adults. So lots of resources there. Looks like there's a next slide is a little bit, oh, no, this is correct. So we went through support specific for students with special needs, and now there are again slides by topic area that I'll go through briefly. Again, are here for your reference for distance learning in general. Okay, structuring time at home. We went over this, but again, things that you can click back on or review around creating and maintaining a schedule, clarifying expectations. We'll go ahead and go to the next one. I think we spent some time there a little bit more in depth already. For virtual learning, extended time at home is actually an opportunity to support students in engaging in things that they have specific interests in. We think about We think about learning time. There might be times that they've completed their assignment for that day, but there's a lot more of the day left. You're working on your own work. What are things that they can do that would actually excite them and be valuable learning opportunities? There are a bunch of virtual learning resources here, from Scholastic Magazine to documentaries for students to watch, different games. The library read-alouds, most public libraries have read-alouds that are free virtual access. I know in my community, I would take my 3-year-old to a Filipino story time, and while we can't go to the library, they shared a link of like a character, Muppet reading a Filipino story aloud in English and Tagalog, which was nice to have that experience at home. But those are resources. There's a link here to Brooklyn Public Library, but again, you could find local resources, or all of these here should be accessible as well. Mystery Science, I do want to highlight this one, especially for elementary age kiddos. They're quick informational videos, and then they give you resources on how you would further engage or extend the learning from the video. KQED is offering a lot of resources as well for virtual learning, for local programming. We'll go to the next slide, which continues with virtual learning opportunities. You can see here, more media opportunities, writing prompts. If you were to create a structure in your day where you were having the student work on responding to a writing prompt in a journal. It's a way to keep routine and structure, and then you'd have lots of ideas to pull from there. There's also some resources here specifically for middle and high school students. That would be good if that's applicable for you. We have just a few more slides in this resource section I'm going to go over so you know what's in there for you. The next one is art activities. There's pretty cool resources on YouTube where you can learn how to draw by following along. There's also tons of ideas for free art projects, hands-on activities, virtual field trips. If you haven't done this yet, I don't know if this was a members thing only before, but I know at least now it's accessible to everybody. But like this Monterey Bay Aquarium example, you can't go to the aquarium, but you can click on the live cams and you can see the jellyfish and the sea lions and the penguins, and you can actually watch. So again, fun learning activity when you can't physically go to the aquarium, but you can virtually aquarium. There's also podcasts for kids, which was not something I had initially thought of as a learning resource, but a good, again, way to build off of students' individual interests and have them learning and engaged and feeling connected with what other kids might be thinking about during this time as well. Next slide is more art activities. You can take a look at those. And then let's go on to movement. So for movement, there are some great online resources. A lot of schools use Go Noodle, where there are different activities to get kids up and moving, something you can use at home too. And it should be free as well. Just Dance is a way that kids can learn workout routines, or not workout routines, but dance routines, and getting kids up and moving. The next one is for yoga. I'd say the Go Noodle and Just Dance on YouTube might be a wider age range. The yoga, I think, is catered to younger students. But any ways that we're able to get kids up and moving. This is also a reminder that kids need to play to be able to learn best, to prime their brains. We all do, and that it's okay for them to get outside as well. It's not only okay, but it's also encouraged to get kids outside and moving. So non-screen options are available for you as well. The next slide talks about access. And you all are, it seems like we had, as Nancy mentioned, a lot of Zoom, experienced Zoom veterans already. And you all are joining us, but as I mentioned before, if your circumstances change to where you know, before having one computer at home was sufficient, but now you're actually having to manage multiple kids being on computers, plus yourself or other adults in the home. There are a number of different resources out right now around gaining access to internet or access to technology. Here's a couple of resources linked in here around internet access. But, you know, again, reach out to your schools or reach out to us if you're in need of opportunities to have access to more tech during this time. Lastly, I want to leave off with this message for the distance learning section. I want to note that these are extraordinary times, so there is no right way through this situation. We're all figuring this out together. Some of the key priorities are to take this opportunity to see your child holistically or your children holistically. That's why we started with the impact and the trauma-informed lens and approaching distance learning through that lens. And then also looking at students, whether your student has an IEP or not, looking at every student and seeing what their strengths are, what are their assets, what are their interests, what do they bring, and how can you use this individualized learning time to have them have access to more of those things, opportunities to apply their strengths or opportunities to engage in learning that's based more individually on their interest and preference. And then also, again, students with IEPs or not, what are the ways that we are looking at their individualized needs and working in close communication with their school teams and service providers to make sure that we're addressing their needs. This is a time where kids are learning, have a unique opportunity with all the barriers, you know, included, but have a unique opportunity to work individually, to work at their own pace, to work, you know, and with different variations, accommodations and modifications through the distance learning. So think about really approaching each child with that individual lens. And then lastly, do whatever feels best for your family and makes sense for your children, their unique selves, these unique circumstances, and really prioritize your whole family's mental and emotional health. That concludes my section on the distance learning, and I'm going to pass it off to Michelle, who's going to speak further about foster youth services coordinating programs specifically.
Thank you. I just wanted to check in with Nancy and Danielle to see if there are any questions that needed to be responded to or any comments that you wanted to make. I saw a lot of questions around whether or not the PowerPoint and links would be available and wanted to make sure everyone knew that they would be. But I don't know how those are being shared. So maybe Danny or Nancy can let folks know.
Sure, we'll email those out to everybody probably tomorrow as soon as possible. We'll email a link to the recording and also we'll PDF all of the PowerPoints and send those out to you.
Great, thank you. I saw there were a lot of questions. Anything else that you want to address during this switch or good to go?
I'd just like to offer, if anybody would like to add a question into the chat box, you can do that. It might be nice, I think, for everybody to maybe stand up and stretch and move your bodies a little bit. This is an intense period of sitting. We're not going over to our neighbors' cubicles to see what they're eating for lunch and what they're doing these days, which means we're sitting a lot more. So please, everybody, feel free to turn off your camera and move around a little bit. I know I did for a while. I got, let's see, somebody wrote in, may I suggest a short document summarizing these strategies and resources that can be shared with LEAs for people who won't listen to a whole webinar. How do you plan on distributing this within school districts, parents, lots of folks. So those are two good ideas. And I don't know if there's a plan on distributing this within school districts. I think that's a good question. Danny, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, but we can certainly send this over to CDE.
Yeah.
And have our friends at CDE have been hosting regular webinars through their department, so we can send this to them, and perhaps this is a resource they can use as well.
Yeah, great. Excellent. And then I think let's just take a few minutes. I know everybody, we just need time to breathe a little bit sometimes. These Zoom calls are really intense. I just read this really great article that said, talked about why Zoom calls take so much time, or not so much time, but why they are so exhausting. And doing this it requires so much intense focus to look at a screen and really hear what people are saying takes different than being in person. So we're just going to take a quick break and do a little bit of I've got a polling question here is, what deep dive into K-12 academics are you relearning? So for example, I've been spending lots of time learning about the American Revolution with my 5th grader. We've been graphing. We've been doing lots of learning about commas and hyperboles. So what are you guys doing? You can use the chat and tell us what topics you are doing a deep dive in. How to make slime. Tamarah, that's funny. US history, 13 colonies, math. Okay, another 2 seconds for the polling question. I'm gonna end it. Kingdom phylum. Oh my goodness, I remember doing that. Oh, you can see you guys are doing a lot of math out there. And then how to get a 12-year-old boy to write paragraphs. That sounds like fun. Okay, here's one more polling question, Michelle, before we go in. Here is, which are you struggling with the most? Engagement or motivation, scheduling, tips for parents on how to teach or guide, how to find more creative, fun things to do if needed, and behavior problems. Issues, I should have said behavior issues or challenges. Okay, I'll keep this poll open for just a minute. We've got almost 60 of you. Teenager motivation.
Wow.
Video games are such a tug. Okay, I'm going to end the polling. So you could see engagement and motivation is the big winner in that. It is hard. Scheduling, tips, you can see. Creative, fun things to do, behavior challenges. Okay, well, I think with that, Michelle, we'll kick it over to you. If anybody has any questions, then please just use the chat box.
Thank you. Danny, if you could just forward it a couple slides, that would be great. You don't need to see that much longer. You can go to the next slide. So I did just want to say we are sending out, the technical assistance team is sending out a Monday blast to all 58 counties every Monday morning. We will include the links to this and encourage our foster youth services coordinators at the county level to share with all of their school districts, particularly their foster youth liaisons, in response to that question around how this might be shared with school districts. I think that's an amazing idea, and we have an incredible resource that if you're not aware of, you'll learn a bit more about during my time with you today. So I just wanted to start with the fact that we want to acknowledge that while we absolutely believe and support all of our students in foster care being treated the same as all kids in school, we know that they also come to us with unique needs, unique learning challenges often, and times of missed instruction because of trauma or movement or instability. And so really looking to think together and across systems and within schools and communities about how we help our kids who may be having some very unique responses to this crisis. Ideas around helplessness and lack of control, as you heard earlier, in reference to kids who have experienced trauma. These can be really triggering times for our kids, and we want to acknowledge that and acknowledge that our caregivers who are caring for these children are facing some unique challenges that are different than what other parents might be challenged by, or it might feel amplified when you're dealing with children who have been exposed to trauma, that are now in these confined settings, don't have some of the outlets that they otherwise had, and are not getting access to some of the therapies and therapeutic interventions in the same way that might have been really helpful to them. So we want to recognize that this is really, really hard. We have all been put into positions that we were not previously in. We are watching the systems that we rely upon and need sort of find their way through to new ways of being in this crisis. We recognize that there are some school districts that are just now fully getting their remote learning or virtual learning programs up and running in the last week or so. And prior to that, things were being done piecemeal. And that's true across the country. So kind of exhaling and sort of giving yourselves all a little bit of a break around the pressure that you've been carrying, I think is really, really important. We're all really trying to figure this out together, public education and all of the stakeholders around our students. That said, I'm a deep believer that you all as caregivers and supports and stakeholders in the lives of students in foster care have an incredibly important role in supporting the academic and educational success of our kids. And I don't always know that that's emphasized as much. There's still sort of sometimes feels like there's this disconnect between what happens during the school day and what happens at home. And now all of a sudden, that's really, really, all happening in one place. And so you are the experts of what your kids need. And now more than ever, you are learning what works and what doesn't work. And those are great opportunities to communicate with your class, your student's teacher or teachers, counselors, special ed case managers, school social workers, really to think about what is it that you're learning about this child or these kids as you're helping them in school and with schoolwork that maybe you hadn't thought of before or communicated before. You may come up with tricks during this time or interventions or things that you kind of click and it works. And that would be something we would really encourage you to share. The school district AB 490 liaison is the person in every school district who is really entrusted and responsible for making sure that every student in foster care gets what they need, is receiving specialized supports and services based on what they need, and that they are achieving success in school. If you are having any trouble getting the resources you need, getting a Chromebook if that's what you need, getting internet access, getting the ability to utilize online resources, that AB 490 liaison may be the best person for you to connect with, and we'll provide some links for you to figure out who that is if you don't know who that is and how you can get a hold of them. There are increasing resources online. It's almost overwhelming how much is out there. How do you cull through it? How do you get to like what's really going to be helpful for your kids? That really is something you should be checking with their teachers on, as opposed to just throwing a whole bunch of resources at them. Just as overwhelmed as we feel, our kids are going to feel just that overwhelmed. So trying to use the experts to sort of weed through everything and figure out what's going to make sense will be really helpful. Next slide, please. I wanted to make sure, as we're talking about resources, that you're aware of CDE's, the Department of Ed's resources for distant learning. This is their website, and it is constantly being updated and added to. Next slide gives you a list of what some of the resources that are currently there, the subcategories you can click on. If we can go to the next slide, Danny. Just to let you know sort of what is happening at the state. A lot of this is going to mirror what your school districts may be sharing and sending out. Sometimes there'll be some more timely information there. There are a lot of COVID-19 updates that are going up all the time, and a lot of different resources and support. So it's just another place to look. But again, there's so much that it is often really difficult to know what is going to be relevant to you. But it is a place you may want to kind of check in and see. If you need supports around how you use these online platforms and how to access them, there is information there as well, which, you know, sometimes it's really like we're at the basics. We just don't, it's a grandma who doesn't know how to do this stuff and really needs some guidance. And that's okay too, because we're all starting where we're starting and taking on some new responsibilities. Next slide, please. So you've heard some of this already, but I do want to reinforce it. It is really, really important for all kids, but in particular, children who have been exposed to trauma and who are system involved, to have their time structured so that they can rely on it. It is consistent. They know what is expected of them and when it's expected of them, and that there is a carve out in every day for, you know, significant schoolwork time, which may look different. It can be a variety of different exercises, as you've heard, but there should be a specific time of the day that it is expected that they'll be working on school and that there are adults there to help them. Nobody goes to school and does everything all alone or learns all alone. And there's no reason why we should expect that now, because of this pandemic, that suddenly our kids are going to be able to take in any information without some assistance, some help about processing it, thinking it through, reasoning it, letting them ask questions about it. And so we really do have a responsibility to be available. It may be that you need to read your kid's history chapter, or social studies or civics or math. Heaven help me if I had kids at home and I had to be helping my kids with math, because we'd all fail. But that is something that we may have to do. You can, I don't know how often it's happening, but you can check in with your students' teachers, particularly around topics like math, that have a teacher's edition with how you solve problems in the latter chapters. You can ask teachers to potentially send you screenshots of those pages each week, so that you can help them solve the problems in the manner that the school would like them to. I can't count the number of friends of mine who have complained about how kids are solving math problems right now and how it is not how they were taught or how they know how to help their kids. I do want to really put the emphasis on that. I think this can be a pretty incredible opportunity. Many of our kids are behind and are in need of remediation, as I said earlier. That is not through any fault of their own. It is just factual that many of our kids were experiencing abuse or neglect right when the most fundamental key pieces of education were being taught to them, and they simply missed it. And so we have this incredible opportunity to do remediation acceleration models with them, which is just a really, really fancy way of saying we're going to give you some foundational knowledge, some basic information that then you can apply to these more advanced ideas you're being asked to do. The perfect example of that are teenagers who are struggling with algebraic concepts. They can't solve for X. And when we really break it down and we go into the processes of what they're missing, we learn that they don't know how to do basic multiplication and division of fractions and decimals. They don't know how to do that with known numbers. And so it's just impossible for them to do that and solve for the unknown. If we go back and we spend some time doing that remediation, now they get to learn that without any embarrassment from their peers, without their classmates knowing that they didn't have that skill set, and we can help them to gain it. And then you'll see they'll make these giant leaps in learning, because now that underpinning, that foundation exists that they've been trying to build knowledge on when they really didn't have it. So we have the gift of time. We have these moments with them to teach them basic phonics and coding, give them funds of knowledge through literature, Children who have not had experiences, children who have never seen the ocean can now read about it or see it online. We can teach them about the world, and that knowledge will be something they can build upon when they're back in a classroom. So even though this is so hard and we're struggling so much to do this, it is an incredible opportunity for us to really shore them up and help them have those basic skills. And the real gift there is that we know those basic skills. That's not calculus that we don't know how to help them with. These are things that we do by and large know, and that we should be able to help them with, at least most of us can. And for the really little ones, for those K3 or even transition age or pre-kinders, reading, literacy, exposure to the written language is how kids learn to read, being read to. There is a great learning theory that every child should start kindergarten having had 1,000 books read to them. And we know that the vast majority of our children come into foster care having never had books read to them. So we get to read to them, and we read to them about things that they care about, things that they're excited about, things that they're interested in, and we teach them that the spoken word is actually the written word, and then they learn to read and build those reading skills. Literacy by the end of grade 3 is paramount to everything that comes after. It is a predictor of graduation, is a predictor of dropouts. So this is an opportunity for us to really focus heavy and hard on literacy, reading, early math skills for those younger children. Next slide, please. Just a word of caution. We are hearing, unfortunately, about increases in cyberbullying because of all the online platforms being used, virtual classrooms. We know that our kids are spending a lot more sanctioned time online, right? Like we used to be able to limit it a lot more, set a lot more firm parameters, not allow them unsupervised time. We may now have 4 kids on screens at the same time, and it's really hard to monitor all of that, particularly because we have to make sure that they have that access. So, keep them in spaces in your environments where you can see what they're doing, hear who they're talking to, kind of keep an eye on it. Schools, I know, are struggling with what to do around discipline when bullying is taking place and when those types of things are happening. And of course, unfortunately, predators know that our kids are online a lot more, and they are becoming more and more creative in how to reach out to them. So let's be thoughtful about that as well. Next slide, please. Just wanted to share, for those of you who are supporting our older students, some important updates. AP exams, advanced placement exams, will be taking place virtually. They will be modified. They are taking place, and your students should have been notified if they are enrolled and scheduled to take an AP. They'll be taking place between May 11th to 22nd. They're shorter. You can access them on your phone if you need to. They're open book, only written responses, no multiple choice, and they're all maximum of 45 minutes. So it's a real abbreviated version of the AP exams. Just wanted you all to know that. Next slide, please. The SAT that was originally scheduled for June 6th has been canceled. The College Board is saying there will be an administration in September. As of right now, the ACT is still scheduled or was rescheduled to June 13th. Those sites, those links are active and will give you updates. I'm not sure if that has been updated yet, but right now it's still scheduled. I'm not sure that that's going to actually take place. Next slide, please. Some more information about how public universities are managing in this crisis. They will not be having at the UC level the SAT requirement for transfer students or for prospective high school students. There are accommodations being offered. at both the CSUs and the UCs, so you can check those sites. You're also starting to hear that some of the CSUs are considering full online programs. I just want to plant a seed that we probably as systems need to be thinking about some of our students who may not be gaining access to dorms in the fall if those dorms indeed do not reopen, and maybe start thinking about some way to support those kids transitioning out of high school after this very odd end of the school year that they're about to experience. Next slide, please. And one more. So I don't want to take the time to survey to find out how many of you are aware of the Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program. But I do just want to let you know we have been in existence at the county office level since the year 2000. Those programs are grant funded through the Department of Education. They exist in Education Code and have a whole range of responsibilities and requirements that they follow. The funding goes to the county office. It varies county to county from relatively small grants to significantly larger grants because they're based on the number of school-age children in that county and the number of school districts in that county. I wanted to make sure you knew that because the services and staffing vary greatly county to county. Obviously, in a county like Los Angeles, where I work at the Los Angeles County Office of Ed, we have the highest number of students in foster care, nearing 25 or 30,000, most of those school aged. We have 80 school districts. The funding and the program and the services and staffing is going to be much different and much greater than in a small county like Mono County that has a small number of students and students in foster care, another county that's on the smaller end of the state. So just know that those programs do look different, but that we are all entrusted with providing supports to every student in foster care that is within our county's boundaries. Next slide, please. So the main role of these programs is to build capacity across all of the stakeholder groups, and those groups include caregivers and biological family members and social workers and attorneys, probation officers, our courts, our CASAs and mentors, and all of our schools and school districts and all the personnel there. We really are less of a provider of services as much as an empowerer of all of those groups so that the folks who are already in direct contact with our kids are getting the supports, the information, the resources they need to meet the needs of those students. We are there to support access to all legal entitlements and rights. I'm going to go over a kind of short list of those entitlements at the very end of this presentation, just so that you have that knowledge. And we do provide supports based on how our Executive Advisory Council and our community has told us they need those supports to be prioritized. But we also focus on those kids with the greatest need and those kids in congregate care settings. And we are required by law to do that and to prioritize those children above others. Next slide, please. So while I said that these programs do vary widely from county to county, they all provide trainings, and they provide trainings to a whole variety of different stakeholders. They focus on their schools and school districts having what they need, as well as all of the other stakeholder groups. They all are making sure to include information on the impact of trauma on learning and education. They provide supports to transition between schools, between grades, and in transition to college and career. Some of our programs are providing educational case management, and you may have students who are receiving direct services from a County Office of Ed FYSCP staff member who is monitoring their academic progress, making sure that they are getting supports that they need, that they are learning and meeting their target goals, and on track with their academics. They are supporting transportation plans to school of origin in partnership with their child welfare agencies and their school districts. And they provide ongoing input to school districts for their local control accountability plans, making sure that stakeholders are having avenues to provide input to those plans as they're developed, and letting our school districts know what types of supports their students need. And that is often based on things that they hear from all of you at in a variety of different venues. Next slide, please. They also provide guidance around enrollment, transfer of records to make sure that a student's records arrive at their new school. They are working diligently to make sure that as kids move, they are getting credit for pieces and parts of classes that they took in prior school enrollments, making sure kids have access to extracurricular activities and before and after school care, those 6 to 6 programs, pre-K and transitional kindergarten, a whole array of school-based supports. They provide supports not only to the folks who are the educational decision makers, but many of our county offices are also helping to gather together professionals or volunteers who can serve in the role of educational decision maker, particularly for our kids in congregate care who are the most likely to not have someone who naturally exists in their life that can make educational decisions for them. They are often a great resource for information about access to special education programs, how it is that you support a student who is receiving special ed or 504 services, and they are often the ones who are making connections to post-secondary campuses and the campus support programs that exist at our community colleges and four-year universities in California. Next slide, please. So they are important points of contact for you. Your coordinator at the county office level connects most directly with the AB 490 school district liaisons that are in the school districts in their counties. So when you are having challenges with access to technology, whether it's a tablet or the actual Chromebook or other piece of technology that you need, or getting online, having free internet access, if there are online resources that you need but you don't know where to find them, if there are changes around what the school districts need to be providing to your kids and how they are to provide it, or information about completing the financial aid applications or Chafee grant processes, access to breakfast and lunch programs at school and direct certification, or any information about what does the next school year sound like it's going to look like, which is a moving target. We don't know right now. It's still in the works and districts are trying to get ahead of the curve. That foster youth services coordinator, in collaboration with the AB 490 school district liaison, can be a tremendous support to you. So please feel free to access and avail yourself of those supports. Next slide. So the how. You should know that our county offices have been in constant communication with their school districts. That is true across multiple departments at county offices. If you have a question, they may be the person most likely who can help you find the right person to connect to. Technology departments have been, moving at a feverish pace, getting curriculum up online, really trying very, very hard to make sure that everybody can get access to what they need, and school districts are structured differently depending on their size as well. So definitely rely on them to be your support. If you need to identify who your foster youth services coordinator is at your county office, the link is there. It lists every county in the state and their contact information. And if you need to know who your AB 490 liaison is for your particular school district or charter school, that list is at the link that is shared on the screen as well. So you have a way to know. We know that sometimes that information changes and it takes a minute to get it updated on a statewide database hosted by the Department of Ed. But most often the phone number you call will tell you who the new person is who does that job if that responsibility has shifted. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to, before I end with you and hand it over to Elizabeth, go over just a brief list of what the basic entitlements under AB 490, which was the first piece of legislation that really opened the doors for students in foster care having a level playing field in public education with intention, and all of the advancements of that core set of rights that exist for kids in foster care, many of which are now federal under federal law. But kids in foster care are entitled to immediate enrollment regardless of records, immunization, fines, or fees. We have had a lot of questions about enrollment during the pandemic when school districts are sort of not enrolling new kids or their district offices are not open. We really recommend that for the time being, to the extent possible, even if a child is changing placements, having them remain connected to their prior school district, which is their right as the school of origin, until the dust settles or until the end of the school year, because certainly everyone is learning virtually, and it's just as easy for them to be connected to their school of origin virtually as it would be to a new school where they're not currently enrolled. Every student in foster care is entitled to learn in the least restrictive environment, never required to attend a non-public school that is associated with their living environment, or a school that is in the best interest of anybody other than their best interest. They have expansive school of origin rights the entire time that they are in foster care, including as they move grade to grade, school to school, and even across districts when there are feeder patterns that they are following from elementary to middle and high. If they are in high school, when their case closes, they are entitled to remain in their school of origin until they graduate with their class. And if their case closes and they go to adoption or guardianship or reunification during the course of a school year, they're allowed to remain in their school of origin through the end of that school year. They're entitled to transportation to school of origin, and that really by recommendation of the federal government should be done collaboratively between the Child Welfare Authority and the school district. They are entitled to 2-day records transfer. Within 2 days of arriving, the school district must request their prior records and the old school district must send their records. There is partial credit protection so that they get all of the pieces of the coursework that they have taken, and they cannot be required to retake a course that they've already taken or retake a portion of a course they've already taken. They have excused absences for court or other case-related activities, though I do want to say those are still absences. Although they are excused absences, they are still counted as an absence. And students in foster care have the highest rate of chronic absenteeism in the state of California. So to the extent that we all can work together to have them miss as little school once school is back in as possible by having appointments be scheduled after school, that is highly encouraged. They have access to CIF sports, even right when they change placements. They don't have to establish residency. And they have an entitlement to reduced graduation requirements to meet a set of other qualifiers as a means to prevent dropout or leaving school without completing. But it is a much lower threshold for graduation and therefore a lower level of education being provided. So we really advise that folks use that judiciously. And I think that may be all that I had. Yep, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of that. So we are, Danny, I think we're just going to scoot right on forward.
Yep, we're gonna move right to Elizabeth.
Okay, we're getting a lot of chatting that this is really, really good and helpful information. So we're really glad that we seem to be hitting a good groove with the information we're providing.
Okay, I guess I'm gonna jump in here. because I know we're scheduled until 3 o'clock, and I know people may have other things that they have on their own schedules for the day. So I try and be very sensitive to that. I'll say the information that was shared today is really honestly incredible, I think, and useful, hopefully, to everyone who's on this webinar. I didn't mention when I started as a attorney for foster youth in LA County. I actually am also a survivor of trauma myself. I have 3 children at home with me now that I am caring for and educating while I'm working full time. So I completely understand, the challenges on so many different levels that you're facing. And I just thank you so much for doing everything you're doing, because I know how hard it is. Some people were chatting about, what are strategies that you're using? And I just wanted to share, for me, having not just a schedule for my children, but honestly a schedule for our family is incredibly helpful to me, because it allows us sort of all to know when I have time for any one of my 3 children to help them with their educational program. It may not be, exactly when they need it because of my own schedule. But we've sort of built that in, and somebody mentioned, what if you have multiple children you're trying to serve? And so that has been helpful to me. And then just having a support system with friends or family, and what Michelle was saying, a contact at your school, whoever that might be. I do think for foster youth, having the foster youth liaison be that contact would really be incredible, because of their wealth of knowledge and the role that they play in supporting those students. But I'm going to talk about special education law. And if it isn't that person, for whatever reason, it may very well be your case carrier for the IEP, hopefully, that you can be interfacing with relation to what you need. And I can't encourage communication enough. And while we may not all get the answers that we want, and I don't always get the answers that I want, even from, in my own personal life and situation, that outreach and that relationship and being able to have an ongoing conversation about what we need is just incredibly critical right now. And it is going to continue to be that important into the coming months, especially for all of you. So I also think that chat reminds me that if there's a social circle that could be created amongst the people in that chat, I think that would be incredible too, because a lot of you are sort of okay, I just wanted to discuss I was asked to discuss what is the state of law with relation to IEPs and the IDEA for children right now. And the first thing that that Danielle asked me to talk about is, and it isn't, the slide didn't get continued here, but we'll make sure it gets incorporated in the slides that go out, is like, what is the definition of parent in these situations? And the definition of parent is codified in the education code. I have that in a slide that you will get. But it is a foster parent if the authority of the biological or adoptive parent to make educational decisions on the child's behalf has been limited by court order. It may also be in a situation where we don't have a parent that is involved with children. And so, we're utilizing the foster parent as well to do that. So there are multiple circumstances, but it isn't necessarily going to be the foster parent. And I think that's what they wanted me to clarify. We all know that we are in school closure. We're in school site closure. We're not in school closure because school is still going on in different ways across the state of California. Michelle already mentioned the CDE resource materials that are out there, and I agree that this information can be incredibly overwhelming. So I do think that to the extent you can access information through your people in your community at your school, that is going to be very likely the most helpful to you. We define distance learning, or the California Department of Education defined it as instruction in which the student and instructor are in different locations. And that, of course, is any in-home instruction. And we LEAs were instructed, local education agencies, school districts were instructed to immediately, when we had our closure, begin developing a plan for distance learning and to start training our teachers to provide services. And that would be the services that you're all interfacing with now. Next slide. The March 17th guidance that the California Department of Education put out, and I put a lot of information on these slides so that you have access to it. And I also put information, Ray, where I got that so that you could go and look at the actual document. But it emphasized that students with disabilities are entitled to equitable access while we're providing distance learning. And it emphasized the importance of serving disadvantaged students. It emphasized the constitutional right to an education, and it emphasized making sure that we're evaluating our ability on an ongoing basis in the schools to enable parents to access instruction and children digitally or electronically. And it also emphasized that we have to have a continuum available, and we do have to have a continuum available as that is required under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that governs students. They also noted, of course, that equitable access doesn't require us to offer the exact same services through distance learning, because we can't be in the same place as children through distance learning. And so we had to come up with alternatives. We also have the complexities of teachers, as someone noted in the chat, at home, also with their families. We have the complexities of parents at home with multiple children that they're trying to educate, and all of us ended up in this situation on the fly. It was not intentional. We didn't have time to plan it. So I would say that most all of the school districts, at least the ones that I work with, have developed some instruction that they're offering to families right now, and that is evolving. It's sort of ever changing and ever expanding as we go through these months. And as Michelle said, we don't know what's going to happen in coming months regarding our capacity to move everyone back to the school sites. So we're learning as parents are learning sort of where we're all headed. But I do know that programs are becoming more evolved as time goes on. Okay, next slide. There's a little delay in the slide feed. We got guidance from the California Department of Ed on March 17th. Wait, that didn't forward. Is it not forwarding?
It is on my end.
Interesting. I see the same slide that I just reviewed. Why don't you go to the next one then?
There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, I wanted to talk a bit about Senate Bill 117. Senate Bill 117 passed just as we were moving into this distance environment, and it did impact some of the entitlements related to students with disabilities. So what it did is it suspended some of these education codes, and the first one that it suspended is the right to examine records of a special education student and receive copies within 5 business days before an IEP meeting or a due process hearing, forwarding records of a student to a new school of enrollment within 5 working days, and transfer of records to another school district within 5 business days. What I will say though is out in the field, a lot of records that are electronically held are being transferred and forwarded to the extent we have access to those records. There are some records that are housed at school sites that people have not been able to go and access, but there are efforts being made to provide records in response to records requests in the field, I know, but these laws were suspended during this time. Next slide. The other things that were waived was the development of an assessment plan within 15 calendar days upon referral for an assessment for a student to be assessed under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So what that means is that in the field, most districts, if not all, are not developing new assessment plans during the time of closure to conduct new assessments. And the pending assessments, both California and federal guidance suggests the pending assessments may be told if it isn't feasible to complete the assessment process right now. So what's happening now is many districts are completing the assessments where they don't need to be doing in-person testing of students in order to complete the assessment, or standardized testing that might be invalidated if they couldn't do that testing in person. But some of the assessments are being told until they can do the testing to get a valid comprehensive assessment. Next slide. On March 16th, we got US DOE guidance on assessment and IEP timelines. The US DOE is the US Department of Education, and the Office of Civil Rights said that IEP teams are not required to meet in person. They can meet remotely, so I've participated in many IEP team meetings remotely over the past month and a half. The timelines for convening annual and triennial IEP team meetings for students are not told during this time. And so those can be held and have been held, but those assessments that may relate to those IEP team meetings have been held if they cannot get valid assessment results by doing some sort of remote assessment. The US Department of Ed has encouraged all of the school districts to convene IEP team meetings during the closure, telephonically or via video conference to the extent feasible. And as I said, that's definitely happening in the field. Next. There are actual laws that say that we can convene telephonically or via video conferencing for IEPs. And they also, existing law already permits us to amend a student's IEP without an IEP team meeting if the parents and the school district agree, if it isn't an annual. So we are in some situations doing IEP amendments. Many districts are writing the distance learning plan in the notes of an IEP or have provided families with distance learning plans indicating what the plan is going to be for providing distance instruction to the children in their district. Next. CDE in its guidance said that for annual or triennial IEP reviews during COVID-19, that the CDE won't count that if there's a delay there in holding those meetings, they won't count that for purposes of their compliance monitoring. They monitor compliance with these timelines, but that doesn't mean that the statutes that require annual IEPs or triennial IEPs are waived or otherwise told. They're not. So these IEPs are still due at the time that they're due. And if there is a reason why they can't be held, because for instance, there might be an assessment that can't be conducted that's necessary to hold that meeting, then they might be continued. But many, many meetings are happening. Next. On March 12th, we've gotten a lot of information from the US Department of Ed and the CDE during this time, and more is coming. More came, I think, yesterday, actually, that I'll talk a bit about. But on March 12th, the US DOE issued a Q&A, and it basically said that if schools are closed and are not providing any educational services to anyone, then they aren't going to have to provide services to students with disabilities. But to the extent they are providing services to any children, which most, if not all, are now, disabled students have to have equal access to that. And they're still entitled to a free, appropriate public education to the greatest extent possible in that IEP. Yesterday, the US Department of Education released new information that they will not be seeking a waiver of the FAPE requirement for students with disabilities. And so that will not be waived during this time unless something changes. When schools come back into session, of course, we have to make every effort to provide special education education and related services pursuant to students' IEPs and 504 plans. Next. On March 21st, we got another supplemental fact sheet just emphasizing compliance with the IDEA and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and an acknowledgement that the services may not be exactly the same. They may not be feasible, it may not be safe, and we have to comply with all of the health restrictions as we are figuring this out. They also did not give us specific methods for providing instruction, and so all of the LEAs in the field are determining what services they're able to provide to serve students at this time. Next slide. In that same, here we go. In that same fact sheet, there's again this sort of emphasis on health and safety of students. And recognizing the LEA's need for flexibility in delivering services. But at that time, there were a lot of schools saying, well, then we aren't going to provide instruction to anyone if it's really hard to provide it to children with disabilities. And they said, you should not and cannot do that. So all of the districts I work with are providing services and to all students, including students with disabilities, but it does vary. Next slide. California Department of Education then came out with more guidance on March 30th, emphasizing that FAPE requirement. So we have the federal law and the state law coming at us. They're really very much aligned right now. Most of the IDEA requirements have not been waived. If we cannot comply with the literal implementation of an IEP, we're to do our best to implement services for that child to receive access to those services, an appropriate program. And of course, we can use alternate modes of service. Next slide. We now just got April 9th guidance, the most recent California Department of Ed guidance I wanted to just talk really quickly about. Next. One of the big questions that was asked was, what do all the IEPs of all the students in the state have to be amended to reflect the change in distance learning? And I gave you the quotes in this just so you guys all have access to it. But essentially they said, no, there doesn't have to be an IEP amendment to reflect the change in distance learning for every child if you're transferring instruction that was otherwise agreed upon in an IEP into the home. Then you don't have to hold an IEP meeting for the purposes of transferring that instruction into the home. Next slide. They also said that it wasn't necessary for schools to obtain written consent to provide what was already previously agreed upon services in the home environment that were already agreed upon in the school environment in alternative ways. Next slide. But they went on to say there may be instances when amending the IEP to reflect a significant change to distance learning might be necessary and appropriate, and we can obviously do that remotely. Next slide. And parents can request an IEP team meeting, and they can propose an IEP amendment, which is why I think connection to your 490 representative as well as to your IEP case manager, and if they could work together, that would be even better. Then you really could have two contacts that are sort of working together to make sure that the plan that you're getting now is working for you and your child within your own environment. You really are serving one of our most vulnerable populations. Next. CDE just acknowledged in that same guidance that it will take time to begin services and that communication with parents is like absolutely critical in order for us to even begin to provide distance learning, because the parents are the ones who are being asked to be involved in their children's education. So I wanted to let you know that that's in writing from the California Department of Ed. Next slide. One of the last questions that was asked is a school district precluded from providing services to students in person or in the home? And they answered that by saying no. In some exceptional circumstances, LEAs may need to provide certain supports and services in person in order to maintain students' mental, physical health and safety. But they said that of course has to be done in compliance and in conjunction with our public health departments and all of the guidance that we're getting from our public health departments. But right now I am beginning to see more conversations about when we can return students to school settings, particularly students with special needs, because it's very hard for them to access distance instruction in many cases. Next slide. Okay, that's it. That's just my law firm saying I'm not anyone's lawyer on this webinar. Next slide. Thank you. I'm finished. I'm trying to be as efficient as I can. And I'm happy to answer any questions or interface with people after this. I normally go into the chat and do that, but I just haven't been able to do that yet.
Thank you for being so quick and speedy. Sorry, Danny, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No problem, go ahead.
I was just going to actually say, Danny, how would you like to close? We want to be respectful of everybody's time.
Yeah, we'll close out with, you can send any questions to my email box and I can send those to the presenters if you would like me to forward it on to them and try to help you all out that way. We will record this and distribute this for all of your family and your friends that think that this would be helpful to. And then tomorrow, PDE is hosting a virtual support circle for parents during COVID at 4 o'clock on their Facebook page. So I just thought people might find that helpful as well. Thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to leave
Thank
this
you.
open. I'm going to leave this open for just a second in case anybody has any questions they want to add into the chat window. But thank you all to the presenters. Thank you, everyone.